Right, so I came across a comment from one of you guys regarding the base MacBook Pro, since we actually don't know much about the future of the M1 MacBook Pro because we have a ton of details on the MacBook Air refresh, the higher end MacBook Pros, but not many details about what Apple plans to do with the M1 MacBook Pro. And so I've been gathering some tidbits I've seen around on the interwebs, and so let's delve into it and also delve into my thoughts on this situation and exactly what Timothy's plan is with the base MacBook Pro. And so without further ado, make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumors. And with that being said, let's just tuck in. Right, so the two main tidbits regarding the M2 MacBook Pro actually contradict each other because on one hand we have Mark Gurman, the more reliable source, saying that yes, Apple does plan to make a new base MacBook Pro in the near future, but then we have Dylan on Twitter who says that Apple's getting rid of the base MacBook Pro and it will no longer exist in the 2022 lineup. So yeah, that's pretty confusing, but let's delve into the two possibilities in further detail, and that begins with Mark Gurman. So he says that Apple plans to update the low-end 13-inch MacBook Pro with M2. Now do note, it's interesting that Gurman refers to this as the 13-inch, even though earlier in the report, he does mention the 14-inch MacBook Pro with M1X. And so that makes me think that maybe the base MacBook Pro will not get a redesign, and simply what they're doing is giving it the M2 chip, and that's about it. Now this, in my opinion, doesn't make a ton of sense because of course we have the M2 MacBook Air releasing very soon, and that should have mini LED, a newer design, thinner bezels, all for a cheaper price than the M2 MacBook Pro. So why would you buy the low-end MacBook Pro? It makes absolutely zero sense. Also, do remember that we do have a touch bar with the current design, and that's going very soon. And so again, how does it make any sense that the higher end models don't have a touch bar yet the lower end model does? That would confuse a ton of consumers because obviously to the average Joe, the touch bar is still an upgrade over the function row because it's a shiny, touchy thing that does magical things, and so why would the lower end model have that feature compared to the higher end models? It just makes absolutely no sense once again. I mean, surely if Apple's removing the touch bar on the M1X MacBook Pros, they want people to forget it ever existed, and so yes, again, the chances of Apple retaining this design is very low. And so yes, I'm sure you guys get my point. I think the M2 MacBook Pro with the existing design is just going to confuse the lineup, and so that brings me on to Dylan's tweet that apparently the low-end MacBook Pro could be axed as a whole in 2022. Now yes, initially this might seem completely absurd, but I do agree with this because the concept of a base MacBook Pro used to make sense back in the Intel days because the older MacBook Airs with Intel was so underpowered and was really only fit for very basic usage. And that's where the base MacBook Pro made a ton of sense because for people like me who are wanting to do video editing but of course could not spend a ton of money on a new MacBook because I was completely broke, the base MacBook Pro made a ton of sense because it was offering way better performance than the MacBook Air, but of course it was only $300 more, which is much more reasonable than the $1,800 starting price for the higher end MacBook Pros. But then of course we got M1, and here I am using a fanless MacBook Air as my daily machine, and if you asked me if I was going to be using a MacBook Air as my main computer of choice a few years ago, I would have said it's completely impossible, but here we are, and I'm comfortably using the M1 MacBook Air with no performance issues, and that's really been the case for pretty much everyone I've spoken to. The MacBook Air really is the computer most should buy, and 99% of users would be completely happy with. And so coming back to my point, because the M1 MacBook Air is so good, the base M1 MacBook Pro feels a little redundant because the performance difference is very minor between both machines, and you're paying $300 more for a touch bar that some don't like, and slightly better battery life. So yes, I don't think we need the M1 MacBook Pro, especially when the M1 MacBook Air is pretty much perfect for 99% of users. And of course, once the M2 MacBook Air comes in with its fun colors, it's gonna destroy the competition, and I don't think Apple needs two entry-level laptops because the M2 MacBook Air by itself can easily stand up against the competition, but more importantly, the target demographic for the base MacBook Pro would be happy with the M2 MacBook Air. So yes, I think Apple does not need a base MacBook Pro on top of the MacBook Air because the MacBook Air is pretty much a pro-level machine with the addition of Apple Silicon. Now yes, I know some of you guys might say that if the M2 MacBook Air does not exist, how exactly is the pricing going to work? Because there's going to be a massive gap between the price of the M2 MacBook Air and the price of the M1X 14-inch MacBook Pro. So what's Apple going to do about that? Well, I think there are two possibilities. Either Apple increases the price of the M2 MacBook Air to around the price of today's M1 MacBook Air, which starts at $1,300, and then of course the M1 model we have today sticks around at $1,000. Alternatively, there is a chance the base MacBook Pro does kinda exist, but in a more expensive form, because I can see Apple giving us a $1,500 8GB version of the 14-inch MacBook Pro, possibly with M1X or M2, and maybe that can bridge the gap between the higher end and lower end models. Though again, to be honest, if there is a massive price gap between the MacBook Air and the 14-inch MacBook Pro, I don't think that will be an issue because, as I said, the M1 and the M2 MacBook Air should be fine for so many consumers, and of course those who want to spend a ton of money on the MacBook Pros, well, they're prosumers and they can justify the price hike because they're getting more performance, more RAM, more storage, things they need for their pro workflow. So yes, on the whole, this might be a bold take, but I do agree with Dylan, and I do think Apple's going to be getting rid of the base MacBook Pro in the near future. And of course, if you do need a powerful computer at an entry-level price, you have the M2 MacBook Air, which should be fine for most people. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the base MacBook Pro, but let me know in the comments below, what do you think Apple's going to be doing with this machine in the future? Anyways, thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumors. Check out the video in the icon above about details on the iPhone 13. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya, peeps.